Hello, beautiful community. Let's do a little self-indulgent or collectively self-indulgent conversation about something that a lot of you think about, and that's the prospects of a longer-term war. And let's make it a bit more personal in the sense of what do you, if you've been following this war for a year and a half, need to think about as it goes on? Are old ways of thinking about it still valid? Are there some things you might want to question? What are things to look out for? And so on. So we won't do any kind of a deep analysis, but I've just jotted down a few words that I want to hit on to give us a very partial, limited, but nevertheless hopefully somewhat helpful orientation. So let's do it. First, Russia's plans for a long-term war and a victory that is both necessary and can only be achieved in the long term. You may have seen the Russian military budget as it looks to the years ahead. They're going to be increasing military spending. We're seeing patterns in the education system as well, which indicate that there is thought of a long war, and we're in it to win it, but we're in it to win it in the long term. We can't win it now. So that is real. And my own analysis is that Putin's salad of justifications for the war hasn't weakened but strengthened as the war has gone on, and as embarrassingly as it has gone. The Western-backed resistance that Ukraine has demonstrated is only an indication to Putin that both his regime security concerns and his concerns about the disordering of the international disorder are real, and that his ultimatum that's given before the war begins is still valid. So all of that stuff's not realizable, but all of that stuff is as right and righteous as it ever was, as hard as the situation is. So that's the Russian story. It ain't any different. If anything, there's more conviction behind it than when the war began, in my view. And in this light, somebody on Twitter has recently put it nicely, Yanis Kluger, and he said, look, we risk falling into a certain trap of thinking that Putin's regime is weak, that Russia is weak, and that all of their stuff will collapse if and when Ukraine wins the war. So we either think that, or we think Putin is strong, he's going to be there for a long time, we're going to make a deal with him. And what Yanis is saying, look, the real default position ought to be neither of the two that we've named, but a third. Putin is potentially going to be there for a long time. His regime is potentially going to retain stability for a long time. It's possible. But we shouldn't make a deal with him. So you take one element from the first point and one element from the second point to make this third point, which is the point with which we should start. And we are so bad in our culture keeping two things in mind, right? That we have struggled to say to ourselves, we can't make a deal with Putin, but Putin could be trying to beat us from a position of relative strength for quite a few years to come. We've got to deal with it. A quick point worth keeping in mind on another issue, which is the war increasingly coming onto Russian soil, is the business of a mass casualty, a mass civilian casualty event on Russian territory. I think that that's something we should very plausibly expect to occur. It hasn't occurred yet. And if it occurs more than once, it's an interesting question what kind of politicizing rather, and destabilizing effects it might have. This is a conversation that we're going to have separately, but it's worth keeping that in mind. So far, what the depoliticized blob in Russia has got, they've been able to successfully swallow, even though there is a built-in feeling that this is all grinding into a cul-de-sac for their regime, but it's been possible to accommodate it. Now, is that still going to be the case, and to what extent, if we see mass casualty events on Russian territory? So that's an interesting point worth keeping in mind. It's both a very realistic scenario, and it raises interesting questions about to what extent this will cause destabilization. To the point that you can say, well, the way things are going now, the Putin regime might say, well, we can do this for years. With mass casualty events on Russian territory, will they still be able to say, well, we can do this for years? Maybe so. But it's interesting to watch for that, and we'll talk about it more. In terms of the hardline opposition to Putin, whether these are the quasi-Kremlin-sponsored Z radicals who are sort of parasites living off the regime while opposing it, whether it's the ideologues of return, a la Girkin, who have links to ex-Soviet countries who think that these should still be part of Russia, whether it's the Narodnik sort of inner depths of the Russian soul, people like Dugin or Prokhanov. The point worth making about all of that wash is that there is no button, it seems to me, available to the Kremlin to turn it off, to stop it from generating waves that are going to impact on the regime unpredictably and destabilize it. You can't just arrest or eliminate a short list of people and make that problem go away. There is too much of a current there. I do think that if the regime collapsed, then that current would expire, interestingly. So it is one of those oppositions that's predicated on the persistence of the regime it opposes. But until the regime collapses, its capacity to stabilize it seems to be cannot be eliminated by any set of precautionary actions that the Kremlin engages in. Point about Ukraine. Ukraine is making an important transition. Of course, we know a couple of absolutely obvious transitions that everybody thinks about. The transition from not being brutally invaded by Putin's Russia to being brutally invaded. And we know about the transition of post-war Ukraine and all the challenges of that, however it'll look like. But there is also another very important transition, which we've briefly mentioned. It's really worth putting on the table again. And that's the transition, mutual transition of the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian society from a shorter-term, potentially winnable war to a longer-term, less obviously winnable war. And that requires a certain kind of renegotiation between society and their government. And that is what is happening now and will be happening for the months to come in Ukraine. That's a very interesting process. And it's looking clear now that Ukrainians have to move out of the perception that this government is there to lead them through a short-term winnable war, to the perception that there may be a very long war and this government is going to lead them through that. And that's quite a different enterprise. It's a very delicate, complex transition that Ukraine is going through now, and it's worth following it. Final remark about respect for Ukrainian agency. Now, we often talk about Ukrainian agency not being respected in certain international relations circles, not as a moral point, but as a point about the sense of reality. In other words, certain kinds of underestimations of Ukraine's agency aren't just unethical. In fact, that's rather secondary. They simply don't allow one to see things as they are properly. That's the problem. And that's often talked about. But I think over the last year, I've also been concerned about, and quite a few people have been concerned about, Ukrainian agency getting somewhat lost in the pro-Ukraine discourse outside of Ukraine. And that's worth paying attention to as well. Because there's a risk of the gamification of war ending up in a situation where one wants to use Ukraine as a kind of stick to chase the Russians out, beat the Russians up. And that may conflict with a sense developing on the ground in Ukraine, particularly for Ukrainians who are in the trenches, that this may well need to be a long-distance war, and that there are serious questions about costs involved for Ukraine. Costs around loss of life, for example, right? What is the price of pushing the Russians out at a certain rate rather than a slower rate, and so on? So that tension is already there, and I think my advice to you is be careful with it, right? Because it's palpable, it's there. So if you want to kind of guide, have and you want to say, well, look, I just support Ukraine. If that's what you want to do, then think of Ukrainian folks in the trenches then, right? More than you might think of Ukrainian folks tweeting from Toronto or Barcelona, or non-Ukrainian folks in particular tweeting from New York and Berlin. So that, of course, also, I think, brings out the point of the unrepresentativeness of Ukrainian voices on Twitter, that you shouldn't think that Twitter is a kind of a microcosm for Ukrainian society. You really got to be careful about that. And this is all against a background reality in which certain levels of exhaustion with the war in the West, certain levels of normalization of the war in the West, mean that exaggeration pro-Ukraine that used to be potentially effective a year ago is not as effective anymore. So be careful too about this business of breaking this, breaking that. Ukraine's done this, Ukraine's done that. Maybe it has. But be careful about that feeding into a story where the war is gamified according to a narrative where Ukraine's got to push the Russians out as far as possible. A narrative that might conflict with what feels right and plausible to Ukrainians fighting the war, right? So that sensitivity to Ukrainian agency shouldn't disappear in folks who are globally supporters of Ukraine. But because of the extraordinary literal-mindedness of the internet, let me just restate my analysis of the Putin regime, which is that the current state of the Putin regime is in fact unreformable in being not conducive to us reliably making a deal with it, or Ukraine reliably making a deal with it, right? So it's very important that Putin is set on a wider pattern of escalation, and that a deal with Putin means war later. So don't conflate this prophylactic warning I've just given you about respecting Ukrainian agency with some idea of suggesting that concessions to the Putin regime are good. The Putin regime is constitutively, not just at the level of what they happen to think today, but is constitutively not an agent with whom one can make a reliable deal. And that is particularly true of Mr. Putin himself. Mr. Putin has put his cards on the table, and we certainly should talk to him, but we shouldn't negotiate with him. More on all of this later. Lots of love. Talk soon.